Stone cities stood here before Egypt dreamed of building pyramids. Picture all of it gone, so thoroughly erased that for nearly 2 centuries, the entire outside world was successfully convinced it had never been there. Scientists, archaeologists, and the traditional owners who never forgot any of it are now piecing together what was actually here. And the evidence, when you look at it properly, rewrites almost everything most people think they know about the oldest continuously occupied place on Earth. What we were never taught Australia invented a flattering story early. The story went like this. When Europeans arrived in 1788, they encountered a continent of nomadic hunter-gatherers who had been wandering the same landscape, unchanged, for thousands of years, leaving almost no permanent mark on the country they moved through. No cities, no agriculture, no architecture. A people in a kind of suspended prehistory, waiting essentially for history to begin. That story was not simply wrong in its details, it was wrong in its foundations, constructed not from careful observation, but from the intellectual convenience of people who needed the land to appear unoccupied and unimproved in order to justify taking it. Terra nullius, the legal fiction that Australia belonged to no one, required a particular version of Aboriginal life to be true, so that version was insisted upon, repeated, taught in schools, and allowed to calcify into received wisdom for the better part of 2 centuries. Here is what the actual evidence shows. The archaeological record of Australia describes a continent where, at various points across an enormous span of time, human communities built permanent stone structures, engineered entire river systems for aquaculture, established trade networks stretching thousands of kilometers, and organized permanent settlements sophisticated enough to support specialist labor, surplus food production, and complex ceremonial life. None of this fits the nomad framework. All of it is documented in the physical record. And almost none of it was taken seriously by mainstream archaeology, until disturbingly recently. The shift began slowly in the 1980s, gathered pace through the 1990s, and has been accelerating ever since, as new dating techniques, satellite imaging, and a belated willingness to take Aboriginal oral traditions seriously, as historical evidence, have together started producing a picture of pre-colonial Australia that looks nothing like the one most Australians were taught in school. What that picture shows is not a continent of wanderers. It is something considerably more interesting, considerably more complex, and considerably harder to explain away. It is also, frankly, considerably more difficult to sit with comfortably, because it raises an obvious and uncomfortable question. If all of this existed, how was it so thoroughly erased that an entire civilization managed to convince itself it had never been there at all? The stone arrangements nobody can explain. Start with the stones, because they are still there. Spread across the Australian continent, in configurations that range from single-aligned rows to complex geometric patterns covering areas the size of multiple football fields, are stone arrangements that have been sitting in the landscape for an amount of time that nobody has yet been able to pin down with complete confidence. Age estimates for some of these formations keep getting revised, upward, always upward, as new techniques are applied to material that earlier researchers had simply dated too conservatively because they were not quite ready for the numbers that came back. Wurdi Yuang, in Victoria's Western District, is the one that tends to make researchers stop mid-sentence when they describe it. It is an egg-shaped stone arrangement of more than 90 basalt rocks, some weighing several tons, arranged in a formation roughly 50 meters across, on a low rise near the town of Little River. The Wathaurong people, the traditional owners of this country, have always maintained that Wurdi Yuang was made by their ancestors. They were not wrong. What archaeologists working with Wathaurong elders established is that the arrangement is aligned with extraordinary precision to the setting positions of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes. The western apex of the egg shape points directly to the setting sun on the summer solstice. 2 prominent outlier stones align with the equinox sunset. Additional stones mark the winter solstice position with the same deliberate accuracy. Nobody accidentally builds a solar calendar from multi-ton granite boulders. It requires the ability to record what was observed, the organizational capacity to quarry, transport, and position multi-ton stones with enough accuracy to preserve the alignment, and the intention to create something permanent. Something that would still be pointing at the right point on the horizon long after the people who built it were gone. Which, as it turns out, is exactly what happened. The age of Wurdi Yuang remains officially undetermined, because the stones themselves are notoriously difficult to date directly using conventional methods. Researchers studying the site have proposed estimates ranging from several thousand years to considerably older, with some analyses of the astronomical alignments suggesting the arrangement could be among the oldest astronomical observatories yet identified anywhere on Earth. The researcher who described that possibility in print acknowledged what he was saying. He said it carefully, with appropriate scientific hedging, and then he said it anyway, because the evidence pointed where it pointed, and pointing away from it would have been worse science than simply following it. Wurdi Yuang is not unique. Stone arrangements have been documented at hundreds of sites across Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, and Western Australia. Some are clearly ceremonial, some appear functional, designed to channel or count animals during hunts. Some resist easy classification entirely. What they share is scale, deliberateness, and a relationship with the landscape that speaks not of people passing through a place, but of people who intended to stay. The aquaculture civilization. Some discoveries rewrite a sentence or two. The Budj Bim cultural landscape in southwestern Victoria rewrites entire chapters. The Gunditjmara people of this region did not simply live near a volcanic landscape. They engineered it, deliberately and systematically, into one of the most sophisticated aquaculture systems ever constructed anywhere in the world. And they did this at a point in time that politely destroys several assumptions most people carry about the ancient world. The eel traps at Budj Bim were built approximately 6,600 years ago. Let that figure sit for a moment, because it matters. 6,600 years ago, Stonehenge had not yet been built. The Egyptian pyramids were still more than 1,000 years in the future. The earliest Mesopotamian cities were only just beginning to take shape. And in southwestern Victoria, the Gunditjmara were quarrying volcanic stone, reshaping watercourses across more than 100 square kilometers of landscape, and constructing a network of channels, weirs, and holding ponds designed to trap, contain, and harvest short-finned eels at an industrial scale that supported a permanent, sedentary population. This is not a small or ambiguous claim. The physical evidence is extensive, specific, and survives in the landscape to this day. The channels are real. The weirs are real. The stone-holding basins are real. Researchers mapping the system have identified more than 240 separate sections of channel, connecting a series of natural lakes through deliberate human modification of the waterways between them. Smoke-preserved eel could be traded over long distances, providing a food surplus stable enough to support a community that did not need to follow seasonal food sources around the landscape, because they had arranged the landscape so that the food came to them instead. The Gunditjmara built stone houses near the eel fisheries. These were not temporary shelters. Archaeological investigation of the structures at Tulondo and around Lake Conda found the remains of oval and circular stone dwellings, with substantial walls, hearths, and evidence of repeated occupation across extended periods. These were permanent residences in a permanent settlement, supported by a managed, engineered food system. A village, in any language you choose to use for that word. UNESCO added Budj Bim to the World Heritage List in 2019, making it the first Australian site listed exclusively for its Aboriginal cultural values, rather than for natural heritage. It was a recognition that was long overdue, by approximately 6,600 years, and a significant quantity of institutional reluctance. Traditional owners had been saying what was there for the entirety of that time. Archaeologists finally caught up in the 1980s and 1990s. The formal international recognition took another few decades after that. Better late than never, though that particular phrase has rarely felt more inadequate than it does here. The villages that shouldn't exist. Somebody actually wrote this down, which helps. When early European settlers pushed into southeastern Australia's interior during the 1830s and 1840s, a handful of them recorded what they encountered with enough consistent detail that historians are still untangling the implications today. What these observers described, in language that suggests they genuinely did not know what category to put it in, were stone structures, permanent ones, shaped rock arranged deliberately into dwellings that had clearly been used, repeatedly, over a long period of time. Thomas Mitchell was not a man given to flights of imagination. He was a surveyor, a military officer, and a meticulous record keeper, whose job was to document exactly what he found. Traveling through Western Victoria in 1836, he described what he called a considerable village of stone huts. He counted more than 100 individual structures at a single location. He noted thick walls, solid construction, and evidence of repeated occupation. Then his party moved on, because they had a route to complete and a colony to map. and nobody in Sydney was waiting anxiously to hear about Aboriginal architecture. No survey team was dispatched. No investigation was commissioned. The structures sat exactly where they had always sat, and the pastoral expansion that followed Mitchell's route dismantled them with complete indifference, breaking up the walls for fence posts and farm foundations, because the stone was useful and the history attached to it was invisible to everyone doing the breaking. This was not a conspiracy, which almost makes it worse. It was something more mundane and in its own way more damning than deliberate destruction. It was an economic frontier encountering an older civilization with no legal framework requiring anyone to pause, look carefully, or ask what they were pulling apart before they pulled it apart. The stone was valuable. The structures were inconvenient. The settlers had not come to southeastern Australia to conduct archaeological surveys, and the intellectual framework of the era had already decided, before anyone arrived, that there was nothing permanent here worth surveying in the first place. Mitchell was not alone in what he recorded. Early settlers in South Australia during the 1840s described stone-walled enclosures and semi-permanent structures in country that official maps had already marked as unoccupied. In the Riverina district of New South Wales, observers documented substantial earth mounds at densities that pointed unmistakably toward genuine settlement concentrations. Recorded, puzzled over briefly, and then filed away and forgotten for the better part of a century before archaeologists began taking them seriously again in the 1980s. The accounts came from different colonies, different decades, and different observers, with no obvious reason to coordinate their descriptions. And yet the descriptions coordinated anyway, because they were all describing variations of the same thing. What makes the pattern striking is not just its consistency. It is the visible discomfort in some of the accounts themselves. These were observers who had arrived in Australia already carrying a complete story about what Aboriginal life looked like, a story that left no room for villages, permanent structures, or anything that looked uncomfortably like settled occupation of the land. When they encountered something that did not fit that story, several of them recorded it anyway, apparently uncertain what else to do with it, and then the record moved on without following up. Not because the evidence was ambiguous, because the conclusion it pointed toward was inconvenient in ways that went far beyond archaeology, touching directly on the legal and moral foundations of the entire colonial enterprise. A continent full of permanent settlements is a continent that was already fully occupied. And that was a conclusion nobody in 1836 was particularly equipped or motivated to sit with for very long. What the archaeology actually shows something shifted in Australian archaeology during the 1980s. A small number of researchers began pushing back systematically against what had become the orthodoxy, not from ideological motivation but from the increasingly awkward experience of excavating sites that simply refused to behave the way the nomad framework predicted. The evidence kept accumulating. The framework kept failing to accommodate it. Eventually, something had to give. Researcher Rhys Jones coined the term firestick farming in 1969 to describe the systematic use of controlled burning by Aboriginal Australians to manage and shape the landscape across continental scales. The phrase was controversial at the time. By the 1980s, the evidence supporting it had become effectively undeniable. This was not the behavior of people passing randomly through a landscape. This was deliberate, sustained, continent-wide landscape management of a sophistication that required transgenerational knowledge transmission, detailed ecological understanding, and the kind of long-term planning that does not happen in communities without fixed relationships to specific country. Excavations at Budj Bim in the Northern Territory pushed the evidence for human occupation of Australia back to at least 65,000 years ago, making it the oldest confirmed site of human habitation outside Africa on the planet. The population modelling for pre-colonial Australia has been revised substantially upward since the 1980s, with estimates now ranging between 300,000 and 1 million people at the time of European contact. A continent-wide population of that scale, sustained over that span of time, does not exist without complex food systems, territorial organization, trade infrastructure, and in at least some cases, the kind of permanent settlement that leaves marks in the landscape. Murray-Darling Basin mounds are hiding an inconvenient archaeological truth underneath. Population concentrations at densities sufficient to support specialist roles that are simply incompatible with a fully mobile lifestyle. Grinding stones, fish traps, storage facilities, and in some locations, the remains of substantial structures have been recovered from sites that were occupied repeatedly, and in some cases, continuously for thousands of years. Trade goods sourced from locations more than 1,000 kilometers away have been recovered from single excavation sites, documenting exchange networks of a scale and regularity that require permanent nodes to anchor them. The picture that emerges from the accumulated archaeological record of the last 4 decades is not of a nomadic people leaving a continent unmarked. It is of a continent bearing the accumulated marks of 65,000 years of active, intelligent, deliberate human occupation. Most of those marks are subtle, because the materials and methods of Aboriginal settlement were designed to work with the landscape rather than against it. But subtle is not the same as absent, and the researchers who spent decades looking carefully have been finding, consistently, exactly what the traditional owners told them they would find. The something that erased them here is where the story gets complicated, because nothing in the deep past of this continent happened simply. The collapse, and there was a collapse, was not a single event with a single cause. It was a slow-motion catastrophe assembled from multiple converging disasters across an enormous span of time, each one compounding the damage of the last, until the accumulated weight of all of them together pushed communities and systems that had survived for tens of thousands of years past some threshold from which recovery was no longer possible in the old form. Start with the megafauna, because that is where the environmental unraveling begins. Between approximately 50,000 and 45,000 years ago, Australia lost more than 80% of its large animal species. Diprotodon, the wombat-like creature the size of a small car, the giant short-faced kangaroo, the marsupial lion, the thunderbird genyornis, whose eggs are still turning up in the red center in numbers that speak to how numerous it once was. These were not peripheral species. They were the ecological engineers of a continent, consuming, spreading, and fertilizing the landscape in ways that kept entire ecosystems functional. Their disappearance restructured Australia's ecology in ways that are still being mapped today. Then came the sea. At the peak of the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels globally were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today. Australia's coastline extended dramatically further than its current outline. There was a land bridge to New Guinea. Tasmania was connected to the mainland. The continental shelf, now submerged beneath the shallow seas of the north and south, was dry, habitable land. Researchers estimate that the Australia of the Ice Age maximum was roughly a third larger than the Australia of today, and that additional third was where a significant portion of the population lived, because coastlines and river deltas are exactly where complex societies concentrate. The sea swallowed an entire third of this continent whole, not in a single catastrophic flood, but in a sustained, multi-generational inundation that progressively swallowed coastlines, estuaries, river mouths, and the lower reaches of every drainage system on the continent. Communities that had built their lives around specific waterways and coastal resources were forced inland, repeatedly, generation after generation, as the sea claimed territory that had been dry land for as long as anyone's memory extended. And then the drought came. The mid-Holocene dry period, roughly 8,000 to 4,000 years ago, hit Australia with an aridity more severe than anything the continent has experienced in recorded human history. River systems contracted. Lakes dried entirely. The Murray-Darling Basin, which had supported some of the densest pre-colonial population concentrations on the continent, shrank dramatically in its productive capacity. The eel runs shortened. The seed harvests failed. The food systems that had supported permanent settlement in multiple regions came under stresses they had never been designed to withstand simultaneously. What happened to the stone settlements, the engineered waterways, the permanent villages recorded in early colonial accounts, was not a single overnight erasure. In geological time, overnight can mean 500 years. It can mean 1,000. What it means here is that the civilizational complexity that had developed across multiple regions of Australia over tens of thousands of years was dismantled by converging catastrophes, one layer at a time, across a span of time long enough to be invisible within a single human lifetime, but brutally clear in the deep record of the landscape itself. 1788 was not a beginning, it was an interruption. It was the survivors of its long catastrophe, still carrying the knowledge, still maintaining the law, still connected to country that their ancestors had built and managed and lost, across a span of time that makes European recorded history look like a recent afternoon. What traditional knowledge always remembered here is something that takes a moment to properly absorb. Across dozens of Aboriginal language groups, spread across the entire continent, there exist oral traditions that describe landscapes that no longer exist, coastlines that are now underwater, islands that are now reefs. Rivers that once flowed through country that is now desert. Mountains that were once islands, surrounded by water, before the sea retreated. These stories describe, with specific geographic detail, features of the Australian landscape as it existed thousands of years ago, before the post-glacial sea level rise reshaped the continent's outline. For most of the 20th century, academic researchers treated these accounts as myth, evocative perhaps, culturally interesting certainly, but not literal, not historical, not the kind of evidence that could be placed alongside a core sample or a sediment layer and taken seriously as documentation of actual events. That position has been comprehensively dismantled in the last 2 decades by a remarkable body of work produced largely by researchers willing to follow the stories to the coastlines they described and check what the geology actually showed was there. Researchers Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed published an analysis in 2015 that examined oral traditions from 21 separate Aboriginal language groups, all of which described the flooding of specific coastal landmarks. Cross-referencing the landmarks described in the traditions with the known geology of the continental shelf, they found consistent correspondence between the stories and the actual submerged landscape features of the locations they described. Features that have been underwater since between 7,000 and 9,000 years ago. Stories describing landscapes that were last above sea level before agriculture had been invented in the Fertile Crescent. This is not a marginal finding buried in a specialist journal nobody reads. It is a peer-reviewed, independently verified demonstration that Aboriginal oral traditions preserved accurate geographical information across a minimum of 10,000 years of continuous transmission. 10,000 years. The entire span of recorded human history fits comfortably inside that figure, with several thousand years to spare at either end. The Kuku Yalanji of the Dine Tree describe their ancestors watching the sea rise. The Yolngu of Arnhem Land carry traditions of a time when the land extended far to the north. Aboriginal communities around Port Phillip Bay in Victoria describe specific landscape features that are now submerged beneath the bay itself, features whose existence was confirmed by underwater archaeological survey only after the stories pointed researchers in the right direction. Traditional owners were not preserving myth. They were preserving geography. The distinction is significant, because it means the same communities that remembered the shape of drowned coastlines also remembered the structures, the settlements, and the complex lives that had existed on them. What was lost and what remains tally this carefully, because the accounting matters. In the roughly 237 years since European settlement began in Australia, a significant proportion of the physical evidence for pre-colonial settlement complexity has been destroyed, not all of it through active malice, though some of it unquestionably was. Much of it through agricultural expansion, pastoral development, and the straightforward physical consequences of building a modern economy across a landscape without first understanding what was already in it. Stone arrangements have been cleared for farmland, mound sites have been plowed flat, stone dwellings have been quarried for building material. Sacred sites have been damaged by mining operations, roads, and water infrastructure projects that proceeded because the legal framework governing development in Australia did not, for most of its history, require anyone to ask seriously what they might be destroying before they destroyed it. The Native Title Act of 1993 and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act have changed some of this. Not enough of it, and not fast enough, but the direction has shifted. What survives is substantial. Budj Bim endures, now protected and formally recognized. Wurdi Yuang endures, in the care of the Wathaurong people who have always maintained it. Majed Baby endures, still being excavated, still producing material that researchers describe as transformative for their understanding of human prehistory. The mound sites of the Murray-Darling Basin endure in significant numbers, now the subject of active collaborative research between archaeologists and traditional custodians, who between them hold complementary forms of knowledge about the same places. The oral traditions endure most completely of all. Across hundreds of Aboriginal language groups, despite everything the colonial period did to sever knowledge transmission, the traditions that described what this continent looked like before, recorded history, are still being maintained, still being taught, and increasingly being brought into dialogue with scientific research in ways that are producing genuinely new understanding from both directions at once. What was lost is irretrievable. Nobody is pretending otherwise. The structures Thomas Mitchell documented in 1836 are gone. The detailed knowledge of the communities that built and used them was largely severed in the frontier period by violence, disease, and forced removal from country. The archaeology that might have documented all of it in systematic detail was not conducted before the physical evidence was destroyed, because the intellectual framework of the time made such investigation seem unnecessary. You do not excavate what you have decided was never there. The question this evidence leaves behind is the one worth sitting with. Australia supported permanent stone settlements, engineered aquaculture systems, and astronomical observatories at a point in time when most of the civilizations the Western tradition holds up as ancient were not yet imagined. Those systems were dismantled by a convergence of catastrophe across thousands of years. Then the memory of them was erased a second time, more recently and more deliberately, by a colonial project that required the land to have always been empty. Two erasures, separated by millennia, for entirely different reasons, both working toward the same result. A history that most of the world still does not know existed. The physical evidence is still in the ground. The oral traditions are still being spoken. The research is still being done. What is left, once you know where to look, is not the absence of a story. It is one of the oldest and most extraordinary stories on Earth, sitting in plain sight, waiting for the rest of the world to catch up.